Welcome to Rooted to Thrive, conversations to elevate our humanity. I'm your host, Rochelle Peterson Ansari, Professor P for short. This is your podcast sanctuary for cultivating mindsets and skills to elevate our shared humanity. We're taking a deep dive into practical strategies to evolve as anti-racist, culturally competent, and inclusive individuals and leaders. In each episode, we're bringing you real-world examples and actionable takeaways. We're going to talk about personal growth, fostering connection, and creating positive change that dismantles systemic barriers and creates environments where all of us are valued, empowered, and activate our collective power. This is Rooted to Thrive. Welcome and welcome back to Rooted to Thrive, Conversations to Elevate Our Humanity podcast. I'm your host, Rochelle Peterson Ansari, aka Professor P. And today I am thrilled, absolutely ecstatic to have Kevin Kumashiro, independent scholar, former Dean of Schools of Education at University of San Francisco and Hofstra, for New York, award-winning author or editor of 10 books. Is it still 10 books? Okay, so 10 books, including the just published newest book, the 20th anniversary edition of Against Common Sense, Teaching and Learning Towards Social Justice. You know, the first time I met you, Kevin, was at the International Conference on Social Justice and Education. Yes, you're a baby. And it was in 2011. Now, was that the second one?
I don't know. That might have been like maybe the fourth or fifth at that time.
Okay, the fourth or fifth, because I was trying to count back, because this upcoming one will be the 14th year,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So I was like, I think, okay, so it was about the fourth or fifth, yes. And I always have been drawn to you. Because you were a vicarious mentor for me, someone who, excuse me, takes these concepts that we're talking about and we discuss them in colleges and universities, but you help people, digest them and get this information into the hands of the masses, the people. Yes. And you are so unapologetic for standing for people to have the type of education that they deserve, coupled with solutions, and more importantly, all of the reasons why we should hope. So, Kevin, thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
Oh my goodness. What a treat to be with you, Dr. P. Rochelle. Such a thrill to reconnect and to be able to join your fantastic new podcast and video series. I'm doing okay. I'm grateful to be in conversation with you today because I feel like today was one of those days I woke up with feeling a lot of weight.
Mm,
Weight around on my shoulders around the world because of what's happening around the world, because of what's happening in this country.
mhm,
It feels like a time when the planet is suffering, when
mm,
humankind is suffering,
yeah.
and communities are suffering. And it's all the more reason why, these kinds of connections with
Mhm.
people who are your peeps, where we can dive into the essential role of both kind of anti-oppressive education and wellness,
Mhm.
um, and all of the ways that they intersect.
Yes,
Just think these are the conversations we all need to be having. So it's
that's
a
right.
pleasure and a gift to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad you couched it that way. You said having conversations about it being anti-oppressive and wellness, right? The intersection of those things. I've said this because it is common sense. Okay, my kind of common sense, and probably your kind of common sense, that when we're trying to alleviate oppression, we're doing the work to alleviate oppression. The concern is people's wellness, right? Like we have to ask, are the children well? Are our brothers and sisters well?
you're reminding me of I'm reading this wonderful book right now.
Mm.
What is it called?
Read a
What
book.
Happened to You? What
Mm-hmm.
Happened to You? I think it's Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. And one of the this book is trying to explore trauma
Trauma.
and how do we understand it and how do we heal from it. And one of the wonderful lines in there has to do with, a trauma conscious society is an anti-racist one, right? It's one that recognizes that, these various forms of injustices and oppression, from racism to colonialism to, patriarchy, they they traumatize us. They're harmful,
Mhm.
and our job isn't to just wish them away. Our job isn't even just to address the structural. As you're saying, part of our job is also to recognize that there is healing that must happen as a result of all of these things that we're swimming in.
Yes.
And so, yeah, how do we think about wellness with much more nuance and sophistication? I think that's a
Mhm.
incredibly important question.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's get started. We're going to just jump right in here and just give us a little bit about your background and how you got involved in this work.
Yeah, I was thinking about my journey as I was getting ready for our conversation today. And, right now I work as a consultant, as you said. And because my previous work experiences was as a dean,
Mm.
a lot of my work right now is with deans and with colleges of education that are trying to center democracy and justice in
Yeah.
their work and in their identity and in their impact in the world. Um, but how did I get here? I feel like I've been, whether it's fortunate or unfortunate, I think my journey has taken me in a number of different places and spaces. My mother, for example, was a teacher for a while before she started raising children. So my first jobs was in the Peace Corps and as a teacher. And very quickly, I was trying to reconcile what I'm trying to do with education with what I'm thinking about in the world. How can education do more to, address healing and address sort of wellness and address success? And I don't think I had anywhere near a sense of, sometimes you think back at your earliest years of teaching and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I did that. Things like
Right.
that. But now I'm appreciative that I was able to go to graduate school. And one of the things that graduate school, of course, was very helpful in terms of learning the research and the theories. But I like to say, in addition to fantastic, courses and faculty, one of the things that really catalyzed my crystallized, I guess, my sort of bubbling up desire to kind of figure out what's happening in the world and to dive in were my peers. I was very lucky that surrounding me were a handful of students who were already very politicized and very activist in how they thought about their engagement with the world. And I think they pushed me and challenged me to like think through my assumptions and think through, even what I am understanding to be the problems that we're trying to address, and therefore what the solutions are. So I think that's been very helpful. Those years were incredibly formative. And then from there, I went on to like work in higher education. And then I left higher education and I worked in the teachers union. I worked at the National Education Association for a few years. And then I came back to higher education. And I'm grateful that I've had all these experiences, abroad and in the US, K-12 and higher education, unions and management, because I think it gives me the ability to then draw on these experiences as I try to think about, how do I be a different kind of a leader, or how do I do my work as a scholar, but with a different kind of impact in the world.
Mhm.
And so those are some of the questions I feel like I've been grappling with. I mean, just to kind of wrap up this journey story, I feel
Yeah.
like one of the takeaways for me from when I, kind of critically reflect on my path, and one of the things that therefore I share in a lot of my leadership trainings or even just mentoring work is this question of what's the intervention that I wish to have in the world right now? And I think, depending on the job opportunity that's in front of me, or depending on my skill sets in the moment or my limitations in the moment, my intervention is going to be very different. And so it's not like I'm always trying to do the same kind of work. It's actually, given the opportunities and the limitations of this particular moment, I can have a particular kind of impact. And so what is that impact that I wish to have? And I think that's the question that I grapple with when I've changed from job to job, but it's also the question that I still grapple with as I think about from project to project, whether it's consulting or activism. How do I most feel I can advance democracy and justice in this moment?
Nice. I love it. Yes, thank you. That's important. And I just realized something. I want to bring this over our wonderful microphone. I'm going to bring that over to
Ooh,
us.
fancy. I love it. Yes.
It's lovely. So, well, I'm ready to help the people unpack this teaching against common sense. Now, first, tell us, what is teaching and learning that is accepted as common sense? Yeah.
Yeah, you know, one of the biggest eye-opening moments for me was right after college. I went into the Peace Corps and I was stationed in Nepal as a teacher. And it's in those kinds of moments when you're so outside of your normal kind of points of references that you start to see things that at first might seem strange, but for everyone else is just conventional wisdom. Like, times of the day that you would eat, or how you would use the water faucet, or what was happening in schools, what counted as teaching and learning, or what counted as good teaching for that matter. And it then, makes you question the assumptions I had growing up about times of the day to eat, or how you use water, or what counts as teaching and learning. All of which is to say is that, common sense is often very kind of context specific, very historicized, historically sort of time specific, and isn't always in our best interest. Common sense are often the ideas that a group builds up, as it helps us to socialize new people, as it helps us to function and communicate with one another. But that means common sense often serves to stabilize the status quo and how things are right now. It's one of the main functions of conventional wisdom or commonsensical ideas. So
Mhm.
part of what I was trying to do was, turn this lens onto education. And from one of my earliest books is called Against Common Sense, which is the book that just got re-released. And that's the question I'm trying to grapple with. And so your question of like, so what gets taken as common sense in education? I think that's actually the question we need to be asking all the time. Um, there's this wonderful article that was written when I was in graduate school, not by me, but by this great scholar, that was talking about what have been some of the major reform efforts in education over the past half a century. And part of what they were arguing was that when that reform effort pushed up against what was taken to be just common sense, like how schools have always looked and should always look like, when it bumps up against those assumptions, uh, that's when those reforms are more likely to fail. Just like you can have the worst idea in the world, and with no research to back it up, but if you can make it sound commonsensical, you're more likely to get people to buy into it. So, there's not a lot of research that says that the best way to structure your school year is to run it from September to June, or from 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock, or to have 50-minute time periods for every subject, right? That's just how we created schools, like, say, about 100 years ago, and it's persisted ever since, even though there's a lot of research that says maybe that's not what schools should look like. And on the flip side, I talk about in some of my other works, reform initiatives that maybe it taps into things that we assume make sense. Like, there's I think a conventional wisdom that says competition fuels improvement. It motivates us to try harder, and through that effort we're all going to get better. It's like when I compete with my brother playing chess, or it's like when two grocery stores in the neighborhood are trying to outsell one another. Competition sometimes fuels improvement and effort, but it doesn't always. And yet, if you can make a reform initiative sound like it's going to incentivize competition, you're more likely to get people to buy into it because it's tapping into that underlying narrative that we already buy into. So that's kind of what I've been trying to grapple with, whether it's at the reform in error level or the level of curriculum and teaching and student interaction. What do we often take for granted? And sometimes aren't those the stories that most need to be rattled?
Yes, yes. Often, so I'm a teacher educator as well, and often students are still coming in, whether they're in-service teachers at the graduate level or pre-service teachers, undergrad and grad, they're still coming into my classroom. I teach cultural foundations of education, urban ed, etc. When I encounter them, we still have people in this year, right, in this millennium, coming in thinking that education is not a political act.
It's one of those stories, right, that
Mhm.
folks are so invested in, that
Right.
education is like this neutral thing, right?
Neutral,
Um, and in fact,
objective.
it's subjective. We can get there. It reminds me of this wonderful book in the 90s called Practice Makes Practice that looks at student
Mm,
teaching. And one of the takeaways for me from that book is the idea that one of the biggest hurdles, one of the biggest challenges that teacher preparation faces is not so much that students don't know what makes for good teaching. It's not that they lack that knowledge, although they kind of do, but it's more that they already think they know the answer to that question, right? You don't get to be a teacher unless school kind of worked for you, right? You had to be able to do pretty well in school, get into higher education, get into a teacher prep program, and then get hired as a teacher. So for many teachers, especially new ones, they try to teach in a way that worked for them.
mhm.
They think, well, it worked for me, it's going to work for other people. They replicate what worked in their experiences. And of
Exactly.
course, that worked for people who did well in school. And
Right.
what we know is that a lot of people aren't doing so well in school. How schools operate isn't working for a lot of people. And
Right.
so our job is actually to get them to unlearn what they thought was good teaching in order to grapple with other ideas of what makes for that.
Yes. And I find, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. You have experiences with people around the globe, more so than I do at this point. I'll catch up with you. But tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the number one thing that's missing from preparation of professional educators. And that is that work to unlearn that there's one single story, right? Like to unlearn the things that we're carrying with us. I often tell people that racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, you name it, right? Religious oppression, ableism, if I didn't say that already, walks into every classroom, walks into every room with us. We have to interrogate it. We're humans. Humans, the way our brains work, it actually gets conditioned, right, for us to go ahead. I know I see you. You're ready to say
Oh, no,
something. Go
I'm
ahead.
nodding
I'm listening.
vigorously to your listeners. Yes, I mean, these systems of difference and oppression accompany us everywhere. And even if we have the best intentions, it doesn't mean they suddenly disappear. So I'm just nodding as you're saying this is sort of like the big barrier that we don't do so well. And I think that's right. I think I agree that we we meaning education as a field, I think often think that the problem we're addressing is a lack of knowledge, and our job is to try to give more and more. And I think what I've been trying to grapple with really since I first worked on that book, Against Common Sense, is um, is that our central challenge is actually to first unlearn what you already thought was the case. In other words, it's not so much a lack of knowledge, it's often a resistance to knowledge that we're actually needing to grapple with. And if I could just quickly explain, so for me, the theory that I found super helpful, and I use it, by the way, even when I do my leadership work and my consulting work is this theory that I call like learning through crisis or learning through discomfort and resistance. And it's the idea that it's kind of this four-part theory. Part one is what we're talking about right now, that learning often involves unlearning, right? It's not the case that students like walk into our classroom and have no idea what we're talking about. It's actually very often the case that students already have preconceived ideas of pretty much any topic you're teaching about. So our job isn't to simply give them more, it's to actually get them to question what they thought was the case in order to then be open to new information.
Yes.
But that then leads to the second part of this theory, which is that unlearning can make us uncomfortable. Like I like picking up a book and thinking, oh, I thought that was the case. And look, Dr. P says that right here. Like I don't like picking up a book and learning I was wrong the whole time. But the
Right.
important part of this aspect of the theory is that the more invested I am in my knowledge or my beliefs, the more uncomfortable I might be when I have to question it. So if I thought the world was flat and you're telling me it's actually round, that might make me a little uncomfortable. But if I thought I got to where I am because I'm smarter and I worked harder than everyone else, and you're trying to now teach me about concepts like privilege, entitlement, and advantage, well, that might make me really uncomfortable. And that leads to the third part of this theory, which is that discomfort can make us resist. Discomfort can lead to resistance.
Mhm.
So if you think about it, like if I'm in a conversation and someone's telling me something that makes me uncomfortable, I don't usually think to myself, that's making me uncomfortable. Like, can you tell me more and make me more uncomfortable? Like, that's not usually my response. My response is usually, oh, I either need to leave this conversation or I need to argue and push back. So learning can lead to unlearning. Unlearning can lead to discomfort. Discomfort can lead to resistance, which brings us to the fourth part of this theory, which is that education must address resistance. And this is why I like to say, the conventional wisdom tells us education is all about giving more information. We assume they lack knowledge, and so our job is to give them more. But this theory tells us the more you make that your primary sort of framework, the more you try to teach in that sense, the more students might actually resist the very thing you're teaching because you're leading them into this space of discomfort and resistance, and there's no productive way to work through those emotions. So we actually need to address that paradox of teaching and learning. We need to address the notion that unlearning is central to how we learn, and teachers are no different than any other learner. Like they're walking into the classroom with a lot of assumptions, and this doesn't make them bad. It makes them human. Like that's the sort of essential part of teaching and learning that I think often is missed in teaching and
Mhm. Yes. Unlearning. Yes. It's unlearning. I love your framework. And, when you got to resistance, it was very clear, right, that there is a fight or flight response, right? And so that's our amygdala just operating like a normal brain, just to bring the point that we're operating in those same spaces, right? I have had to reflect on, what keeps me in the fight, right? I was one of those people who liked school the way it was delivered, and I gave back what was expected of me. And yes, then I become an educator, right? But and so I didn't come from a place of lack of privilege, because there are people out there who will have this story, right, about why they work more specifically around anti-oppressive education or for equity in education, right? There's a story around not being treated well or witnessing it. However, I just often felt like, why doesn't everybody get what I'm getting? you know, I did feel that for the most part. So I still try to keep digging deep because I have to connect to people who did not have my story. I want their children, their grandchildren, their grandchildren's children to have what I had. And for the life of me, I can't understand. I really don't understand why I was just, I and a small group of people were deemed worthy, except for the fact that those people who poured into us really were just replicating what they saw. Replicating, right? Like it's either you caught it or you were taught it.
Yeah, you're reminding me, as you can tell, I love to talk about some of my favorite books. So another of my favorite books was written almost 20 years ago. It's called The Queer Art of Failure by
Mm,
Halberstam. The Queer Art of Failure begins with one of the things I take away from this book is it begins with the idea that we often say failing is a good thing because eventually it's going to lead to success. We say we learn from our mistakes. Failure builds character. Try and try again. Um, but that assumes that we actually should want to succeed. And so what this book argues is maybe failure is good, not because it eventually helps us to succeed, but because it gives us a standpoint from which to question whether we want to succeed in the way you're defining. It's not unlike queer theory and queer activism, right? That isn't about assimilating. It isn't about saying we're all like, the norm. It's about saying, or maybe what society defines as normal isn't the way that we should all be trying to be. It questions these kind of conventional wisdom. It questions common sense. And so when I think about education, I think about how you know, we often say today that the purpose of education is to provide equal educational opportunity and help everyone succeed. But as I'm imagining you cover in your classes all the time, that's not that's not why we created the earliest public schools. It couldn't possibly have had those goals because the earliest public schools weren't for everybody. You had to be white and male, and your family had to own property. And as we were forced to include more and more students, we came up with more and more ways to separate and differentiate them, such as through segregation and through tracking and through labeling and through discipline. We might say today that the purpose is equal educational opportunity, but historically, the function has always been to sort and to socialize. We've just come up with different ways of doing that over time. And if we take seriously that this has been at the foundation, this mission, this socializing, sorting mission has been at the roots of public schools from the very beginning, then it does get us to question, well, what does it mean to succeed in school? Are those who are succeeding really the smartest? Or are those who are succeeding those who are the students who are succeeding, those who have learned best how to play the game, those who have learned best how to demonstrate assimilation and conformity. And
mhm.
it's not to say that that success has absolutely nothing to do with smartness and effort, but it does get us to rattle those definitions and to think about how the demand to assimilate accompanies all of these other stories, but often get unquestioned.
Right. Oh, definitely. I recently wrote a piece about my journey to be a culturally relevant and sustaining educator, term we're using in Pennsylvania, around being culturally responsive, basically, right? And, I talked about being in middle school and realizing that that being in the top of the top honors class gave me currency. It gave me currency around discipline. I started a fight and people believed me when I said I didn't. When the other person was someone who was not anywhere near the honors track, right? Like there were three honors tracks. She was not in any of those. I don't know what courses she was in, but not in those three. And they believed me. Yeah. So I would raise my hand to say that we are by and large learning to play the game. And regardless of whether we see it as a game or not, we are indeed assimilating. We understand what is expected of us and we can deliver it. Some people understand it, but can't deliver it, right? Like I have family members and I know legions of people who are very artistic, right? Like they're artists and they are often had the most terrible time in their K through 12 experience because we're not teaching to people with those strengths, those assets.
Yes. And then they start to internalize stories that something is wrong with them, right? Yeah,
People told them that something was wrong with them.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah, Lonnie Guinier, the amazing
Mhm.
legal scholar, tells this story of, being at a family gathering and there's this race, this competition of boys versus girls, and the parent, and she tells us the three kinds of questions that we could be asking about this competition. And what we often ask is, who's winning and who's losing, because we want to figure out how we can fix the losers. How can we get the losers to compete like the winners, right? There's a second kind of question, though, that one of the grandparents asked, which is, well, who made the rules to this game, right? Because
Yes.
it's people in positions of power who often make rules, and they make the rules in
Mhm.
ways that benefit them. But Guinier points out that there's even a third kind of question, and all of these questions are important. But there's a
Mhm.
third question that perhaps gets asked the least often, which is, what's the story that we convince the losers to make them believe that this game is fair, right?
Mhm.
That there's something wrong with them, and that's why they're losing. So whether it's kind of the quick fixes of how we help losers to assimilate, or whether it's a structural analysis of who made the rules, or whether it's a cultural and narrative analysis of the stories we're buying into, they're all helping us to do this kind of power mapping, right? This really, really important understanding of, or with an analysis of the problem that surfaces much more of the complexity. And I think that's what we need to be doing when we try to understand how we advance democracy and justice.
Yeah, it's surfaced the complexities. And that makes people uncomfortable because we're looking for one solution, one action to take, as if that were going to solve all of our all of the issues. But when I think about uh, how we are defining people, how we're defining that loser. Yeah, that struck me when you said that. Like we're defining people as losers in the first place. you know, from us, even though I have a competitive spirit. I do. I do. Like, basic games, I want to win.
Yeah.
But I'd be okay if other people won, but I want to win. you know, but I would say generally in life, I don't want anyone to lose. Yes. And that's what anti-oppressive education is striving for. It's for all of us to win despite the structure that was set up that did not include all of us. Yeah.
It's one of the reasons why any reform initiative that's based on the idea that we're going to foster competition is problematic from the start, because a competition presupposes that there will be winners and losers. We
Yeah.
cannot be, as a democratic society, creating a public education system where we expect many to lose or to fail. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about how, the notion that we want to build school systems where we expect some to fail has become so commonplace in how we think about education, whether it's from the left or the right or the Republicans or the Democrats, constantly coming up with strategies that are about how you can help your kid do better rather than how we can create a system where everyone flourishes. And
Yes.
it's that kind of reorientation that is missing in so many of our discussions.
Yes. Definitely. Powerful question. How can we ensure everyone wins, everyone flourishes, everyone thrives? Rooted to thrive. Yes.
Rooted
Rooted
to
to thrive.
thrive. Exactly.
Yes. So let's talk about the moment in time we're in right now. We're seeing all kinds of things happening in the political realm, in the public discourse around education. And I know you have a message of hope for our listeners, right? Who are they're in states where there are book bans. Um, Help them unpack what that really is. Yes, like what are we seeing right now in terms of the backlash that infiltrates our educational systems, particularly our public educational systems? What help them see what that really is and why there still can be and should be hope.
Yeah, I'm just resonating with your question, and yeah, it's an emotional question, right? Because it's so overwhelming in this moment that it's easy to feel demoralized and hopeless. So how do we understand the moment that we're in so that we can actually bolster our hope and our courage and our drive to make things better? You know, one way I think about this moment is that it's a moment when I think the interconnections of different goals and initiatives are just can be very front and center if we pay attention. You know, an example would be in the midst of all the censorship bills, can't talk about CRT, can't make kids uncomfortable, don't say gay, and you know, book bans and all of that. We just needed to do just a little bit of behind the scenes work to realize that the organizations pushing those initiatives are the same ones pushing voter disenfranchisement reforms, right? Here's a perfect example of how education can be and often is an institution that plays a central role in either advancing or hindering democracy, right? It's not unlike, I think about this question that my friend Bill Ayers once asked when he was speaking, and he asked us, you know, what would education look like in a democracy, or what should education look like if it's advancing democracy? Because if education is in this, you know, maybe a totalitarian, if it's in a fascist society, you would imagine that the elite would get something really awesome, well-funded, highly compensated teachers, rich curriculum that teaches them to be creators and leaders and innovators and thinkers and questioners. But the masses would probably get something really impoverished, something really watered down, where they're learning to maybe more follow the rules and not really think for themselves. And, you know, we're all looking around and we're thinking, yeah, that sounds kind of like what we have here, this kind of
Right.
two-tiered educational system. So it raises the question, well, if we say we're a democracy, what would education look like if we were advancing that? And I think that realization is why when you see regimes that are either coming into power or struggling really hard to stay in power, they go after the institutions or the sectors in society whose role it is to question conventional wisdom, right? They'll go after the journalists, they'll go after the scientists, they'll go after the artists, and yes, they'll go after the educators, which so often happens. So censorship, demonizing teachers and unions, banning books, scripting curriculums, narrowing standards, these are actually all, they make a lot of sense if the larger picture we understand to be that of attacking and restricting democracy and limiting our ability to really fight back, right? If education does its job, democracy is strengthened, but that means that the power structures that are currently in place are going to be rattled. And that's why
Yes.
people can be scared. So that may seem like depressing, but the reason I bring all of that up is to say, I actually think that's what gives me hope in this moment is when education does its work. It's just like when social movements do their work,
Yes.
they're changing what we think is possible and what we think society could look like, right? I like to say that, you know, education isn't, you know, we don't have education so that we can learn to succeed in the world as it is. That might be part of why we have educational systems. But to me, the real exciting potential of education is that it can build our capacity to imagine the world as it is not yet, the world as it could be, and then to build towards that world if we so choose. And so, you know, we're just as democracy is always in the making, it's always being built. So too with democratic education. So yeah, it's not the case that a free society is one where there's no oppression. I think a free and democratic society is one where you're able to name the injustices and work against them. And this is our moment to name those injustices and figure out ways to work against them collectively. And I think last thing I'll say about this is what else gives me hope? This is a moment when folks seem to be coming together in pretty unprecedented ways, right? You're seeing mass uprisings, you're seeing lots of collectivizing and organizing in ways that build on what's worked well in the past, but also in ways that are unique to this moment. Young people are organizing, right? People in the South are organizing. Unions are seeing this new sort of eruption. And I think that also gives me hope, is that people are yearning to be part of something bigger.
Yes.
And those opportunities are multiplying and are making themselves available. And so let's dive in. In fact, I said that was my last thing, but I'll say one more thing on this, which
That's
is
okay.
going back to your first question of what am I doing now? So because I'm a consultant, I feel like I can be a full-time troublemaker.
Yeah.
I can
Yes.
be working full-time as an activist. And so one of the things I try to do is build up these networks where we can act collectively to try to have more public impact. So what does it mean for scholars? Not to write your own piece and publish it in a journal, which is important, but also to come together with 100 other scholars and write in the media about how the research doesn't back up this reform. Or as a leader, not just be brilliant as a leader in your institution, which is important, but also how you come together with 300 other leaders to speak about what's problematic with this particular reform. I think those collective endeavors that um, show us that we can have a different kind of impact in the world if we work together. I think those have become the bigger priority for me and what gives me much hope in this moment.
Yes. A clear anchor is our collectivism. I hear it loud and clear and agree totally, right? Like I don't know any justice, any effort to create more justice or a more equitable space, society around any issue happen without the collective.
Yes.
It's absolutely necessary. In our own strength, what could we do? Sure, some of us are great orators and can speak and will get a lot of opportunities to share around the world. But those who really move the needle never did it alone.
And even to bring it back to one thing I see is so, elevated in the work that you do. Um, we also need to think about like self-care and wellness and healing as collective endeavors as well.
Yes.
Um, and I think that's one of the problems with, the whole self-care movement that has really picked up in a lot of education spaces and activist spaces. Sometimes they use really language that is limiting because
Mhm.
it's so much about what can you do for yourself
So, right.
rather than what can we do for ourselves, right?
Yes, the we. It's interesting that you brought that up. Can I just say this? When there was a moment when there was like this definite shift during COVID, when I heard more and more people saying, resistance is rest, I was just like, who's resting? Because listen, so, I felt some type of way. I did. I was like, okay, wait a minute. Like, what do we mean? I just felt because we have so many, I guess, quote unquote allies out there, right? Who may believe that they are co-conspirators in the fight. And some are, but I was like, if any of those folks that are teetering, you know, on the fence, on the edge, those people who pull back when they say, oh, well, some clients or some people are going to push back and you better watch out for yourself. Like those folks don't need to hear that it's time to rest. And I don't think I've ever felt permission to rest. This thing is larger than us. And I do believe it's from the collectivism of people who literally died for me
Yeah.
to have what I have. How dare I? Because I'm not going out and facing dogs. Okay. You're not going back. No, that's not happening. Okay. For me, I don't even do the large crowds, you know, because of what can happen in a large crowd. But what people did for me to have this, people who would not have the education that I have so that I could have it. Come on.
It's so helpful, as you're saying, to remind ourselves of the role that so many have played in struggle,
Yes.
the groundwork that they laid, how different people can engage and should engage differently. We all have different skill
Yes.
sets, but that we all need to engage, and we
Mm.
all need to unlearn too. I mean, one thing you're also making me think of as you're talking about colleagues who sometimes respond and you're like, what? I think about people like myself, like or friends of mine who talk a lot about justice and anti-oppressive education and activism, um, but sometimes still occupy spaces in higher ed like any other higher ed person. So they might say great things, but they treat their students horribly, or they can't work together with their colleagues, or they're just totally out there self-promoting themselves. And they might look like all this great person, but what's the impact that they're having beyond what higher ed folks normally have? And are they benefiting from the capital that comes from claiming you're a social justice scholar? So
Right.
yeah, I think there's unlearning that we all need to be doing. Um,
Hmm.
and part of that unlearning can only happen when we're working collectively.
Yes, indeed. Yes. Many of us do. And the institutions of higher education, the culture does breed that, right? Like, so, for many people, especially in academic affairs, right? So, on that side of the house, because there's many other sides of the house. Um, but on that side, many people are, um, actually they're rewarded, right, for looking out for themselves and getting recognition. That's what the system perpetuates that. So I don't want to blame people. I get it, but they do need to stop and take inventory. Yes, to say, hey, what am I doing that is making a real difference? Because we don't need extra people who just talk the talk. We
Yeah,
don't. Like, no, thank you.
I love the insights you're sharing. Yeah, higher ed, as with so many institutions, is really good at perpetuating itself. And
Mhm.
so it's going to create all these policies, all these reward systems, all these identity formation processes that make certain that everyone who's coming into higher education can perpetuate higher education.
Exactly.
So being successful in higher education doesn't necessarily mean you're a change agent. It might mean you're an arm of that institution. So yeah, I love the idea that there's a lot of, you know, kind of critical introspection that needs to be happening that raises questions about, are you having the kind of impact that we most need to be having in this world? Um,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yes, yes. So that's for our justice, our social justice educators, for our brothers and sisters. Like, let's just really keep it real. Yes, let's keep it real. And the at the end of the day, we want the next generation, right, that is being educated, whether they are children, youth, young adults, older adults. Hey, you know, we want them to be able to push an agenda that helps make this world a better place for them and their families as well. But again, if we don't have a paradigm, if we don't have the thinking as a collective in any of these spaces in our spheres of influence where others are, like the health of others is our concern, I believe we fail. We fail
Yeah, you're
at
reminding
thinking
me of,
humanity.
yeah, how do we think more broadly about who we are, versus these narrow notions of us and them? And
Mhm.
you're reminding me of one of my mentors who a long time ago was once talking about how we often think our job is to, especially if we ourselves identify with some marginalized community, we
Yeah.
think our job is to advocate for our community. And that is a part of our job. But I liked how she said, well, I actually think that, our job is to advocate for those whose differences make even us uncomfortable.
Come on now. Yes.
And then you're really getting at the people who are most on the margins.
That's right.
That's justice work.
That's
And,
right.
so again, it's like really questioning, really basic but dominant understandings of what it means to do education work or justice work or whatever. And how do we constantly make certain that we're holding ourselves accountable to these very lofty ideals that we claim to be ours?
Yes, please, all of us. Ah, that just touched my soul, right? The comment that you made just touched my soul because one of the things that has grieved me uh, terribly is when people who like grew up living in poverty or working class, poor working class, etc., are the people in our educational spaces, especially in schools, right? That say, still point the finger at parents. It's the parents, or it's this, or it's that. They get these elitist or have these elitist notions, and they don't realize it, but they'll say they're the best champions for particularly our Black and brown children living in poverty. And it's like they actually don't know. I'm just going to give them the benefit of the doubt that they don't know that they are perpetuating. They're saying they're perpetuating the same um, stereotype, and the same behavior that is going to limit those children and their families. Now that's because in the recesses of their mind, that person is like, well, I made it out. So they think it is a thing to get out of. They don't see the assets in their communities. If they stopped and reflected on it, they would, or did some introspection, they would see all of the beauty, all of that created them, right? All of that and more of that created them. But when we try to give back and we're in these schools and we don't see ourselves accurately, unfortunately, we are perpetuating the same oppressive ideas and ideologies on our children and their families. And that just must stop. And it's often people who look like us that
Yeah.
don't understand what they're doing, right? Replicating that status quo, which is where we began this conversation.
Yeah, I'm just nodding vigorously, and I'm thinking about how sometimes the hardest people to reach or to work with aren't those who are willing to say they disagree with you. They're those who think they're already there.
Yeah.
And so anytime
Mhm.
we meaning even myself, find myself feeling like so self-righteous that only I get it, those are the times when I need to hit that pause button and say, maybe this isn't the way to move forward. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I'm willing, even on this platform, to share vulnerably about those areas where I've had to challenge myself, where I
Mhm.
forgot. We all,
Mhm.
we're human. I get it, but it's so important, for us to do that work, that internal work, and do it with accountability in the collectives, because there's that collective again, right?
Yes,
Whether you're talking about two people or 100 or 1,000
yes,
people, we need each other to grow.
yes. So true.
We need
It's
each
one of
other
the
to
reasons why I just have to say on a very personal note, my morning began very rough this morning. This
Yes.
conversation with you has been just incredibly rejuvenating. Um, and I hope others will find that same takeaway as they listen to our conversation.
Awesome. And I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time, your expertise, as always. Is there any final advice that you would give to someone, looking to improve for being anti-racist, for, racially just, culturally competent, inclusive in their practice, in their way of being? Anything you would share? Final thoughts?
Final thoughts. Oh my goodness. I what comes to mind as something that's lingering as you were talking about COVID
Hmm.
is that the great writer Arundhati Roy, this wonderful piece called "The Pandemic is a Portal." And she
Mm.
says that when we hit a moment like the start of the pandemic, a major crisis, our tendency is to rush back to normal. We try to return to normal as quickly as we can. But what that ends up doing is it drags with us all the problems that were a part of normalcy. And so rather than trying to rush to normal, return to normal, she argues that we should use moments of crisis as a time to hit the pause button and to imagine how we might move forward differently. The pandemic could be a portal, like a doorway to some other, reality that we're building towards. And I think that's what I would say as well, is like these are difficult times where we think about what's happening around the world or happening around the country or happening to our planet. And it's easy to want to sort of figure out how we get back to how things used to be. And I
Yes.
think I would take Roy's urging that rather than do that, let's actually use this as a moment to pause and think about what's the world that we're trying to create. What's the world we're trying to build towards, and how can our work in education help us accomplish just that?
Excellent. Oh, wonderful final note. And how can people reach you after this closes? We'll have information in the show notes, but tell us how we can reach you after this.
Well, I would love to be connected to folks who are listening or watching. And so my website is just kevinkumashiro.com. And that's where they'll be able to see what I'm working on and some of the events that I organize where they'll be able to be a part of it.
Excellent. And I have to tell you all, there is a lot of information up on that site. There are events there. There's so much of his thought leadership there and the thought leadership of multiple collectives on Kevin's page. It's a treasure trove of information. You don't want to miss it. Yes. And please pick up this book. I don't want to mess up the name. I'm getting ready to mess up the name. I don't want to mess up the
Oh,
name. Say the name
against
of your
common
latest
sense.
book. Yes, it's the 20th anniversary edition of Against Common Sense. There's more to it, isn't it? Like
Teaching and learning towards social justice.
that's what I was. I was like, wait, I'm gonna mess up the end. I'm gonna mess up the tagline. So I want to thank you again and again and again, Kevin. I really appreciate you taking this time. And I want to thank everyone for stopping by. Please leave a comment, subscribe, share this episode, and thank you again for listening to Rooted to Thrive.